meeting is being recorded.
Okay, I think we can get started. Thank you all for joining us. This session is just to chat through some disaster preparedness aspects on the small business side. We're going to introduce ourselves, but just to kick off, know that everybody's muted upon entry. If you have questions as we are going through, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we're going to collect them and have a Q&A session at the end that we'll go through them. And if we have enough time, we're also going to have a short window to talk through any experiences and thoughts you guys have as well after we get through our questions. Please know that we are recording this just for others that couldn't make it. But if there's no further ado, we will get started. So just to introduce myself, my name is Kendra Pospychalla. I've been with Rural LISC for almost 3 months now. I just came on board. I'm the Director for Disaster Response and Resiliency. And so I've been working in disaster management for about a decade, and then I was in business development and finance for about 6 years prior to that. Master's degree in disaster science, and I'm also a certified emergency manager. So all things disaster is my realm. And I will be doing most of the presenting today, but I do have 2 of my coworkers here who are specialists in other aspects of this conversation that will be here to help with any questions on their end as well. And I will kick it over to you, Evelyn, to introduce yourself.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Evelyn McKinney. I am a program officer with Rural LISC. Really excited to be here today. Know that a number of you who have joined in are either entrepreneur serving organizations or organizations that have small businesses in your communities for which you have partnerships and are supporting. We are really thrilled that you have joined us today. We're hoping that the information really sparks innovation and creativity and dialogue within your communities, and excited to be here. Look forward to speaking to everyone a little bit more at the end of this presentation. Beth?
Thanks, Evelyn. Welcome, everyone. My name is Beth Haskovic. I'm the Small Business and Lending Program Officer. So my work focuses on access to capital. I've been with Rural LISC for about 4 or 5 months now, but I've been on the LISC team for about 3.5 years, working in coordinating ecosystems for small business development and providing support and capacity building for small business development organizations, and as well as local economic development departments. And I'm based out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So happy to be part of the conversation, and as we start this conversation, identify ways that we can help solution for access to capital in response to disaster recovery.
All right. Well, to kick us off, let's just chat through kind of why we're here and what the intention of this presentation is. So if you were expecting for me to talk through how to write a plan, that's not really what this is going to be structured around. I'm trying to take a step back and talk through just the general concept and condition of some of the small business challenges in disaster preparedness, particularly in rural areas. So some of these are pretty generic to small businesses in general. You'll find different studies and statistics, but generally some of the most reputable ones range anywhere from 25 to 40% of small businesses or businesses in general never reopen after disaster. Some studies you'll find get up to in the 80%, depending on the vulnerabilities of the community. Yet despite this, most nonprofits and small businesses don't have any plans for disaster and don't have any intention of putting together plans for disaster. So, and we're going to talk through the rural condition in disasters, but small businesses within rural areas are particularly vulnerable. And we're also going to talk through what aid isn't and is available, and also want to chat through some myths that are driving some of these situations. But before we get into that, also taking it down to ground level here, and what is a disaster? Talking with folks already, I can already hear that COVID, for example, is not usually framed as a disaster when it is, right? And so as we talk through this, one of the lenses that I'm hoping everybody looks at is redefining how you're thinking of a disaster, not necessarily through the pop culture way of hurricanes and wildfires, but more of a broader term. And so this definition I have on here is actually the official definition for disaster. And so if we start looking at disaster as a serious problem that occurs over a certain period of time that causes widespread human, material, economic, or environmental loss, which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. So if you start looking at a disaster as any serious problem that causes you loss, it's going to open your lens of what to be preparing for. Because if you're not considering it a disaster, you're probably not going to be preparing for it, right? The other angle of this that I'm hoping that we can focus on is really the definition of a disaster comes down to the ability to cope and what exceeds that ability. So in preparedness, if we can focus on two things, increase your ability to cope, you are therefore alleviating the disasters, right? And the second is where you can't cope, as an organization, as a person, as a business, where can you find aid to compensate for that? And so that's a lot of where this conversation, I think, is going to be centered around. But again, wanting to open up the way we're defining disaster as we walk into this conversation. So just a brief overview on small businesses and disasters. Most critical infrastructure within communities are actually owned and operated by the private sector. So the ability of small businesses, large businesses, businesses in general to recover from a disaster directly impacts the entire community's ability to recover. And that is, I think, an important lens for us to look at too. Small businesses that rent their facilities actually have less control over mitigation and preparedness because they don't have control over the infrastructure and any of those vulnerabilities from a property standpoint. And job loss actually catalyzes migration, which turns into a cycle of economic downturn. And then businesses owned by women, veterans, and folks of color are far more likely to not recover. Also, businesses located in coastal areas are more likely to not recover. And then the last little plug is studies have shown, and there's also varying studies on this too, $1 in preparedness is generally $6 saved in costs and recovery and response. I will caveat that most of those studies have focused on physical infrastructure, which will matter a little later. But I want to talk through some myths. These myths are the major assumptions that are made that are kind of creating some of this inertia around why folks are not prepared. One of the myths is the greater the amount of physical damage on a small business, the greater influence on their recovery. This actually, property damage doesn't have it is not the primary or only variable driving a business's recovery. And so as a result, a lot of the focus on preparedness is pretty limited to physical. And when I say physical, I mean the building, any equipment and supplies. Yes, they matter, but it's not, it doesn't take a centerpiece as much as a lot of times we think it does. The reality is business recovery outcomes are far more impacted by the impacts on customers, on their employees, disruptions in the business from the utilities and infrastructure, road closures, things like that, vendors and supply chains, just how markets change after a disaster and the new normal, which is very common and it varies in degree depending on the disaster. That's where COVID is not nearly as unique as I think a lot of times we make it out to be, because yes, a whole new normal came from COVID, but this in its own way, shape, and form, after every disaster, there's going to be some kind of new normal to adapt to. And so that is actually a key variable in recovery outcomes. Second myth is aid. Small businesses and the sector that I just came from, this is especially a myth. In the NGO and relief side, a lot of times small businesses are not a target for a lot of relief services because there's these assumptions that they have insurance, that they have these resources through their profiting mechanisms. But this is actually this is actually quite a myth. One, most aid that is available is in loans. So small businesses still end up in greater debt after a disaster. And then the other is that compared to families and public entities, there just isn't services in general that are designed for small businesses. And there have been some studies that demonstrate that the more aid, which again usually comes in the form of loans, the lesser the recovery success over the long term of a small business. And then also most funds that are available that don't come in aid are usually only available after a federally declared disaster or a declared disaster in general. Not many funds are available before disasters so that people can prepare. So myth number 3, that brings me to insurance. Most small businesses are not as covered by their insurance as they think. They don't understand their insurance. They don't carry it at all. And a key piece that is not usually covered by insurance is just general business interruption. And again, it's far more focused on the physical, the building, the supplies and the equipment. So takes us to number 4. Number 4, having a plan makes you prepared. This is one of my favorites. There's a significant, and this is not just from a business perspective, but government, organizations, individuals, there's a psychological symbolism behind having this documented plan that makes us feel prepared. And this is called the paper plan syndrome. When I was in grad school, I had a professor who used to say that planning templates were the worst things to happen to preparedness. I can't agree or deny with that, but I will say I completely understand where he was coming from. As templates, we've seen usually turn into kind of a game of like Mad Libs, where everybody fills in the information, but the actual act of planning, it doesn't happen. Planning is a process. The greatest value in it is working with other individuals, whether that be their vendors, whether that be any agreements that they may have with other businesses. It's understanding the vulnerabilities and risks of their employees, those kinds of things, the fact finding, the decision making, the discussions, and the learning is the greatest value in the planning process. And so templates tend to create a temptation to skip all of that and just write in the information. And they generally produce what is often known as fantasy documents, because one guy often writes it himself. It's usually a product of his imagination and assumptions he's making about what other people will and won't do around him as it would impact him or her. So this is a huge myth. Just having a plan, as tempting as it is sometimes to check that box, it in of itself does not demonstrate that someone is or a business is prepared. And then 5th, this is the one that I'm going to unpack a little bit more. So preparedness, common preparedness approaches are leading to lesser impacts on businesses. In other words, the myth is that the common things that we think of to engage in preparedness activities are working. A lot of research and even experience demonstrates that in most cases they are not. So this is where getting innovative and creative in the way that we approach these things is going to be really important. A couple of the images that I have on the screen here are just a few examples of free resources that are available to small businesses to help them prepare. Guides, checklists, sometimes you can find little online training modules. Lots of them are out there, right? Yet we see small businesses are usually not prepared. So where's the gap? And part of it is that preparedness, the key part of it is that preparedness is behavior change. And so you have to assess what those barriers are to this change in order to understand how to address them. So while these tools and online learning modules may address knowledge, there's a whole lot more that goes into it that is required to help somebody go through that behavior change process. But even despite all of this, folks don't oftentimes, you can hand them a handbook and it doesn't mean that they actually prepare. One of the analogies I like to give is if if I were to sit into a 2-day class about how to exercise or eat right, people can lecture me all day long on what I should be eating, what exercises I should be doing. It does not mean I'm going to leave that class and start going to the gym every day and completely revamp my diet for the rest of my life. It's just not the way a lot of these things work. So this is the big myth around preparedness, is if we just give a book or if we give a webinar, then everyone will change and become more prepared. So both these images are from FEMA. The image on the left is the preparedness cycle. And so my interest here is not to help everybody become subject matter experts in preparedness, but what I am hoping to do is to help show how it's not as simple as sometimes it seems like it should be. So the preparedness cycle really kind of looks at it more from an organization or even a business perspective, a group of people essentially. And in order to ensure preparedness, a plan is only step one. And then after the plan, you need to equip to it. If the plan says that we'll use a backup generator, you have to actually have a backup generator in order for the plan to work, right? So after you plan, you need to organize and equip and make sure that you have what you need to execute the plan. And then you need to train anybody in actually executing the plan, because when a disaster hits, everybody's not going to run and find the business continuity plan on the shelf in the back closet and start following it. So you have to train people and then exercise it, and exercising it not just for the purposes of practicing, but also for testing if the plan worked. Once you try it out, you may realize that a whole lot of things didn't work the way that you expected, right? And then improve it and go back to your plan. And so this is a cycle, and it's got to be maintained. If you write the plan, put it on a shelf, it will not get used. That is a very, very known. So part of the interest in preparedness is turning this into a way of life for the business, which is not easy, right? Like it almost most would even say that that's not feasible for a lot, and we're going to chat more about that. The image on the right shows, this is from FEMA too, and it shows the different stages of behavior change and where the US population is in terms of their preparedness level. And you can see over 7 years, that's graph is showing, we've been able to move a fraction of the population from stage 1 to stage 3. And that's with a lot of investment in preparedness over 7 years, right? So this is not simple. So again, not trying to turn everyone into subject matter experts in preparedness, but I am trying to help show the lens of a greater science behind this. So some of the common barriers that we see to people actually taking actions, one is knowledge. Sometimes you just don't know what to do or how to prepare, what to be thinking about. And so knowledge is genuinely a barrier. However, it's not the only barrier, right? And when we say knowledge, this is where the workshops come in. This is where a handbook or a checklist might be helpful to help guide people. However, it can't be done alone. The other is risk perceptions, which is probably one of the trickiest of them all. This is very psychological, sociological around how we perceive risks and what actions we do or do not take based off of those perceptions. And lots of science behind that, but there's definitely an impact on that to whether or not people prepare and how they prepare. The other is a very common one, resources and funding. If you don't have the money for the generator, you're just not going to get a generator, right? And so that is not going to work out. Time and personnel. Sometimes businesses don't have the staff capacity to actually focus on these things to begin with. Even if they have the knowledge and they know it's important, just don't have the staff capacity to work on it. Competing priorities. There's a lot of things. We're trying to put the fire out each day. Then thinking long term about these things is definitely a challenge. Management support. Even if you have somebody full-time dedicated to preparing your business for disasters, they will be minimally effective if management is not on board with their efforts. In order to prepare, you need to ensure that other parts of the business or organization, if you're preparing an organization, are participating and engaged, so that if you plan for IT to do certain things in your plan, IT has actually said, yeah, we can do that. And so everybody needs to be on board and working toward that same goal. And if management is not supporting that and ensuring that resources and staff capacity throughout the organization are supporting it, that person is going to be minimally effective. So that is often a barrier as well. Inaccurate assumptions, which we just talked through some myths, right? Also very tightly tied to risk perceptions. But if you assume the only thing you need to worry about is your insurance, then those assumptions are also going to create barriers to being prepared. So with this, you can't prepare for everything. And this is probably one of the biggest lessons learned more recently, and COVID has also highlighted, is we can't prepare for everything, and there's diminishing returns at some point, right, on things that you prepare. So this is where innovation and adapting are particularly important. So in addition to helping people prepare, we also want to help people understand how to adapt to the changes in a disaster that they may not be prepared for or may not be able to prepare for. There's a term in academia called dead business walking syndrome. And that's after a disaster, things have changed. Supply chains are different. Some vendors are available. Others maybe have scaled up and can do more. And a dead business walking syndrome is essentially when the business continues to try to do things the way that they were in the context of the new disaster, and eventually it doesn't lead to successful outcomes. And so it's the inability to adapt. So one of the things to be focusing on in a more innovative way is innovation itself, and helping some of these small businesses identify these new opportunities and where these changes can be made. Operating environments change after disasters. Like I said, anchor stores may fail and impact surrounding businesses. So even if one business is still doing well, if some of the other anchor stores around them fail, then they may lose business as well. Like I said, changes to customers and supply chains, vendors. So innovation. So community. One of the things that we wanted to talk about was community, and we share each other's vulnerabilities. You can't pull the business out of the community. If employees are unprepared, then in a disaster, they're going to impact the small business if they can't show up to work, right? If the employer is not prepared, then they may impact their employees because they need to shut down their business. And now people are out of jobs, or they're temporarily even out of jobs, and which then impacts the community. And then governments. The big angle here with governments is if a government is not prepared and planned for disasters, then they're not going to be able to protect the population, which is going to affect small business, not just through their customer base and their employees, but also things like utilities and infrastructure that small businesses are also relying on to keep operating won't recover quickly, and therefore they'll impact the small business. So you can't necessarily always pull these things apart, but our communities are super important and part of this conversation for small businesses too. So with that, wanted to talk through the rural condition in general, particularly on the government side. If the governments are not, like I said, if they're not prepared to protect the population, this directly impacts a small business and limits their ability to recover as well. So we do know that in rural areas and rural communities are far more cash strapped, and they have less diversified economic base, which makes them less resilient economically, and they are less likely to maintain a rainy day fund. Some communities, some that I have even worked with, they do have funds, an emergency fund. Rural communities are less likely to have that. There's a more acute underinvestment in mitigation and preparedness. There's lower capacity for emergency planning. And a lot of this comes from expertise and knowledge base on how to prepare, how to write emergency plans, and then staff capacity to do it. And a lot of these communities, I'll probably know, everybody wears like 12 hats, right? So it directly impacts the government and community's ability to prepare and plan, which therefore impacts small businesses. Accessing networks and consultant services. I did work with Los Angeles County and Los Angeles City years ago, for example, and they hired lots of very good, robust consultant services to do their disaster and emergency planning. Rural communities just don't have, even if they had the funds, they don't necessarily know who and where to turn to find consultant services such as that, which creates additional barriers for them. Post-disaster, and again, won't get too much into this, but there are, especially if a federally declared disaster, there are mandated recovery frameworks, and those always struggle to be implemented in rural areas. And part of those recovery frameworks include economic recovery. So due to lacking knowledge, staff, and resources, these things often are a challenge in rural areas as well, which slows down economic recovery. When resources do become available, so if resources such as funds, whether they come from private donors or government, they surge in a disaster, a lot of times these communities and governments, organizations, they don't have the ability to scale and take advantage of those resources. So if we have a nonprofit whose annual budget is $1 million and then today we gave them $2 million to scale, that may be a challenge for them to be able to do that very quickly. Greater pre-existing medical infrastructure and communication challenges, not having broadband access in some of these communities generally causes a lot of challenges on the response and recovery side. Predicted increase in migration to urban areas. Again, job loss and other things like that exacerbate this. And as migration continues to increase from rural to urban areas, this is also impacting preparedness and resilience. So I was only able to find statistics like this on wildfires, but I wanted to give a quick snapshot of some of these things. This is from the National Fire Protection Agency, a study they did in 2017 on rural areas. And you can see that in rural areas, there's 3 times as many fires per person, essentially, for the population as there are in larger urban areas. There's 4 times as many deaths from fires in rural areas as there are in urban areas. And for most of these communities, the vast majority of these communities, the resources to support these risks and threats are very limited. Like you can see the statistics here. Most of these communities are all volunteer fire departments, which is not the same case in urban areas. And most of those that are volunteering in those fire departments are an aging population. So the intention here is to show how the threat is higher and the resources to support that, just proportionate to the populations, are definitely rural areas have a disadvantage. So where do we start right now? If you have the capacity to go write a business continuity plan, by all means, go do it. But I think that if one thing I would encourage is to take a step back and let's look at some easier first steps. And one being, take inventory of what your preparedness barriers are, and when I say your as an individual, your family, but also your business or the organized business development organization you work for. You can look at it through any lens you want, but as a starting place, I would encourage just really sitting down and thinking through what are the challenges that you're having to becoming prepared right now. Why don't you have a business continuity plan? Why are you not exercising it? Does your staff know what to do in a disaster? If they don't, why? Is it management? Is it lack of resources and staff? I am particularly interested to know this answer as well, as that is going to help inform some of the support and resources we would advocate for on our end at Rural LISC as well. So once you have identified them, start to think through how you can address some of these. You know, if it's a matter of staff capacity, you know, are there grants and funding out there that could help support this? You know, just start to think through some ideas as to how you can address those barriers. Check your insurance. It never hurts to check in with your insurance in general anyway. Understand what it will cover and what it won't cover. And with that, kind of goes hand in hand, know your hazards and vulnerabilities. Hazards meaning what kinds of disasters might you be more prone to? Are you in a high wildfire area? That kind of thing. And then the vulnerabilities. The easiest way to do this is what the Marine Corps they call wargaming. Essentially take like a worst case scenario and talk through it in your head how you could and would address that. Essentially try to break your operations in this worst case scenario. And that's really going to be a kind of a fast and easy way to start to find your biggest vulnerabilities. But just the very act of thinking through this, you don't have to sit down and have to write a plan right away. Just starting to think through this will definitely be progress. And then the other thing is to become an advocate. Like I said, you can't parse out the community and the family and the individual from the small business. They all interact. We're in this boat together. So becoming an advocate for preparedness in your community with your friends, your employer, is also a big step in the right direction. The other aspect that I want to advocate for is that you be an advocate to your local governments as well. Do they have an community emergency plan? And what focus are they doing on that to ensure that, you know, utilities and critical lifelines can get restored quickly? That is also an angle to advocate for that will help small businesses. And then if you have any disaster-focused planning committees, and a VOAD is volunteer organizations active in disaster, it's essentially a network that may be in your community of folks that come together to plan, essentially. If you have any entities like that in your community, I advocate that you get involved. My personal experience has been there's not been a lot of representation and subject matter expertise in those forums that come from an economic and small business side, and they're definitely needed. So those are things that I would encourage as first steps. So some initial resources if you are interested and ready for these things. Recently, FEMA just came out with the National Risk Index. Just came out in, I think it was like January, February. I find it extremely helpful. It's a map, and you can look at it at a county level or a census level that does a very robust analysis on the hazards and the impacts in your community. And they look at it from a social resilience perspective. They look at like potential costs on the agricultural sector, different business sectors. They look at the different hazards. It's very robust. I would encourage you to look at it if you have the interest and time. And then here are some generic free resources on business continuity in general that are also helpful as first steps. So, but what are we doing in Rural LISC? So now that I've given you that background and kind of seeing where our lens is at looking at this in the big picture, know that our goal is to ensure preparedness, not just produce materials. Yes, ultimately we may be producing some materials and training and such, but the focusing a bit more on the outcome and small businesses actually being able to withstand and adapt to a disaster is our goal. So we want to use a lot of these sciences as we go forward and thinking through how we support you and anyone else in the community in helping these small businesses in their preparedness. And we're kind of looking at two different programs. I say this as a disclaimer right up front. These are not funded. They may not happen right away, but these are generally the direction we're trying to go. Want to make them known to you. If for no other reason, I would just love to hear your thoughts on some of this. I know we have some partners that are already kind of working in this space, trying to help some of these small businesses with continuity. I'd love to learn lessons from you, understand what you need in order to do some of this. But do know this is not yet funded and actionable, but giving you an idea of our dream here. So what this continuity program would be essentially to help you provide business continuity consulting, crisis innovation help to small businesses free of charge in your community. So we would do this by essentially training up what we're calling a business continuity planner within your organization, or maybe more than one, depending on how this all can get designed. But we train up a business continuity planner and in basic business continuity stuff, as well as how to focusing in on the innovation and adaptation piece to the new normal. Really want to make sure that's included. It's a little outside some of the standard materials that you see, and how to maintain these programs, not just write a plan, but we also want to help equip you with training, guidance, any funding support that we're able to get to help you with staff capacity to do it, equipment and supplies that you may need. And then if we're able to, like any small grants, particularly directly to those small businesses for any supplies that they need. These are some of the things that we're thinking about and trying to make happen. Connecting you to a network of peers, not only of rural LISC business continuity planners, but that would be a peer cohort that you would have to lean on and learn from. But also trying to connect to other networks in this space, professional business continuity networks, anything that we're able to make happen. And then any ongoing technical assistance that we can provide, as well as you work with these small businesses, any of the random things that may pop up that you just need somebody to bounce ideas off of. Definitely want to be here for that as well. So again, this is probably the most I would say centerpiece program that is relevant for the small business piece, especially if none of you are watching the news. This year is particularly an area time that we should be thinking about it. Disasters are going to continue increasing, but this year they're predicting 3 to 5 major hurricanes. We're in a mega drought. The wildfires are expected to be pretty significant this year. So definitely hoping that we can provide support in any of these areas, but can't provide a timeline. The second piece that we're looking at, I think I'm going to be right on time here. The second piece that we're looking at is what we're calling our disaster coaches. This one is, if we step back and look at this at a community level, this would be coaches that we train and equip and provide support to that can be active within their community level efforts in terms of disaster, on the advocating for small businesses, being incorporated into disaster planning to ensure that small businesses and economic development is being incorporated into those preparedness plans, any recovery plans. But then also there's on the housing and construction side, if you're an organization that focuses on that, it would also help equip you to be able to be part of those conversations and incorporate your services and get access to resources, things like that. And then fundraising and finance, not to get too much into it, but in community recovery, a lot of times efforts will come together into one big recovery group, and they usually need a financial management organization who serves as a fiscal agent, helps manage the money on the overall community level recovery efforts. And these are all voluntary organizations that usually do this. So we want to help equip you to be able to participate in those efforts if it's something that you're interested in and have the capacity for. So those are the two things that we're looking at right now. Again, would love to chat with you guys more. I know some folks have been already working in some of this space, so we probably could learn more from you than what we can learn from others, but than what you can learn from us. So that's all that I have. We can open up to questions. We have, looks like almost 20 minutes. We can open up to questions, and then after that, I'd love to hear any thoughts that you guys may have initially on this. Did we get any questions?
Thank you, Kendra. Actually, we do have a couple of questions as well as some comments, but I'm also going to allow for participants to unmute themselves. But let me just get started quickly, and then for those of you who would like to speak to the group and take a deeper dive somewhere, we can definitely do that. So the first question that came up is, will the presentation and recording be shared later? The answer is yes. The presentation is being recorded, but we will also, and so we will email that out to all of the meeting participants and anyone who signed up who was unable to attend today. We will also be posting the webinar recording to the Rural LISC website later this week, and you can find that at lisc.org/rural. But for those of you who are on today, you will be sent the recording. So Kendra, Anna Maria Cintrone wrote that this is great information, especially now for Puerto Rico. The hurricane season has just started. Would you like to provide any insight or feedback to her comment?
No, I'm glad that you're getting value out of the information. Thank you. I do appreciate that. And yes, it's I think last I looked, there is even a couple formations in the Pacific, so it's already starting. And yeah, I'd love to touch base with you offline if you have any thoughts or suggestions as well.
And she actually had a follow-up question that said, if you were to divide the suggestions in phases of priority versus resources, where do you begin and what is your suggestion?
Oh, I think that the first and foremost thing I would do, like I said, is take inventory of what the major barriers you're facing to prepare are. And based off of that, I think it would vary depending on your situation. Your biggest barriers are the ones I would attack first, and that's where I put your resources, personally. I also, knowing your hazards and vulnerabilities, racking and stacking those, like what are your greatest threats? That's where your priority should be too. So not all things are created equal. You know, if I would take your biggest barriers, your biggest threats, and I'd focus on those first.
Thank you. And lastly, before we open up the floor, Mildred Franco wrote, she was thankful this is so needed, and she is hopeful the program within LISC gets funded.
Me too. Thank you.
Kendra, this is Tiffany. Oh, you know what? I think I am giving feedback. One sec.
Let's kill the sharing.
Okay,
All right.
hopefully that's a little better.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. So this is really a piggyback from the last question about prioritizing resources. The assumption is perhaps as you're prioritizing, some of that has to do with kind of where you are in the world in terms of risk for severe weather, you know, how as far as the pandemic is concerned, how the numbers are trending as a response to a pandemic type event, access to additional resources. Were there other components that should be considered in terms of how to prioritize?
I think that, no, I would say it's not just hazards. Hazards are important, meaning hazards meaning what types, hurricanes, wildfires, pandemics, cybersecurity threats, those are hazards. Those are things to think about in rack and stack, but also your vulnerabilities as an organization or business in general, and the vulnerabilities of your employees, those as well. And that's why I was saying go through your worst case scenario. But as far as like resources go, it really depends on your own self-assessment of what what the biggest barriers are for you. And again, this small business continuity planning program, a lot of that would teach that kind of thing. What do you need to plan for, and how do you plan for it?
Awesome. Yep, I was going to say, I think you had someone raising their hand.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, sir.
I have a question for the group. Has any of you? I work in local government, and I'm trying to work on my dissertation here and trying to start the research. Do you feel that your local chamber of commerce helps those who are involved or try to be involved with your local chamber of commerce? Do you feel that they helped you out a lot, or have they not been enough help, or do you guys even look to them for help for business continuity in general, or do they not even offer it across the board for those who try to reach out to your local chamber? Because obviously chamber, other than like contact resources like connecting somebody who needs boxes, and I sell shoes, so boxes and shoes, so you can ship it off and get a cheaper rate and stuff like that. Does anybody on the panel reached out to them, or is there even a standard that you guys came across or anything for the group?
So our chamber, hi, this is Mildred. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Our chamber was not involved in any way in helping during the past year and a half. I mean, I run an innovation hub that's focused on entrepreneurship, and I'm like an entrepreneur support organization. And we were really the ones who were trying to find grants for the small businesses and trying to see what their needs were and trying to see how to best help them, keep the doors open or keep the public informed. And then due to our efforts, our chamber finally created like a spreadsheet of the hours for the businesses, but that was really the extent of their involvement in help.
So
They're really not involved in helping small businesses. That's not what they do here. I'm sure there are chambers everywhere, and every chamber is different. And so, but in our case, they were not involved, if that helps you any.
yeah, and part of my idea, again, I work in local government, so essentially in local government, there's grants that we have to write. So I have to write a grant and manage it. And during our grant, we have to do these exercise or disaster exercises based around our hazards. When we do, I'm here in Texas, so we have a lot of disasters here. So like flooding is our #1 disaster, for example, and
Right.
hurricanes and stuff like that. What I'm trying to do is like when we have a major, or say even COVID, so like a major, pandemic, I've noticed that when I was in Seattle, so the last 3 years I was in Seattle. So like my 3 favorite restaurants, which are all Vietnamese, I'm Vietnamese, they all went out of business. So like my main one, my backup, and my backup all went out of business. So I was like, and I talked to one of the guys who was like closing it down, and he just didn't know what to do. And I was like, there's the PPP program. And he was like, I don't even know what that is. And I try to give him my email. So, to help him out, I was like, I could help you do the paperwork because I know what to do. But he never emailed me. And, I kind of feel like if, through the Chamber of Commerce, if they understood basic things like that, to do a helping hand, I think it would get more people involved to join the chamber a bit. I mean, anyway, so, and another last thing I want to state is like, when we do these disaster exercises, I would like to get the community involved eventually, so like if you have a business and if there's a flood that runs through a certain area and closes down your shoe shop, then you would test your plan the same time as with us if you want to run through it. And if you could prove once a year that your plan works through exercise with the city or your local government, the incentive would be, my end game is to show through research, the incentive is, you could show your insurance that, hey, I'm running my exercise and my plan works, and can you give me a discount, up front? Does that make sense? Kind of like I'm testing my plan, and the end game is give me a discount of 10% off because I'm testing it every year, when the city tested. So like, I still have, I got about 7 years, so I'm giving myself 7 years. If I would like to give my email, if I would like to get ideas from people, because I'm assuming these are entrepreneurs on here or people that want to be involved with the chamber. I mean, that's part of my end game here. And I would like to have other people's thoughts in general. If that makes sense.
I
Any
think
questions?
that's a great idea personally, but yes, I think that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I have a long way to go. But anyway, so like so I guess there's nobody here other than that one lady who told me she didn't have a good experience with the Chamber of Commerce. Is anybody here on the Chamber of Commerce that likes that idea? No. Is there any other ideas that people would like the chamber in general to do, like something kind of like that, other than that one person saying they finally gave in and helped a little bit? So,
Well, what we could do is maybe if you toss your contact information in the chat, and then maybe folks can catch up with you more longer conversations.
because I do agree with your statement on the template thing where it's more of a knowledge base. And I like your example on, I could go to a nutritionist and take a 1-hour seminar on what to do and what to eat and calorie count, but not apply it. So that's one hurdle that I've been noticing, that when I do reach out to these chambers and give like a template and then try to incorporate it, like the application is not there versus the knowledge, you know what I'm saying? So anyway.
So I have a question for the group. I know that we have some partners that have been trying a bit of this already. I don't know if any of them are on, but I'm curious, if you have been trying this to support small businesses in continuity and preparedness, what were some of the challenges? And if you could ask for help with something or resources with something, what would it be?
Was that a question to me or in general?
In general, to the group.
I think that people should get their own list of resources and, get the top priority, like water, number one, water. And to a lot of rural areas are on well, and they need a generator to run their water well. I think that somehow to have some kind of sheet to pass out for people to start getting ready for their priorities in case something does happen, so they can take care of themselves and not have to so much depend on the government and other subsidies around. Somehow to get people more to encourage them to be prepared themselves. They need water, they need food, they need supplies, they need fuel, that 25-year food, that stuff, they can keep forever, and it'll be there if they ever needed it.
Very nice. Anything else? And as you as an organization, if you're trying to help the small businesses, is also curious if there's anything particularly for you that you could use from us to help support you in doing that.
And piggybacking off of that, I am curious to learn a little bit more on, what BDO organizations were able to provide in terms of access to capital to help folks bridge the pandemic or other disasters, if there have been products in your local market, or what the need might be there.
I would like to see funds go to some of the fire departments, because when something happens and so a disaster happens, you know, people run to the fire department first. You know, if they're in a rural area, where do you go? There's no stores open, you go to the fire department because they have water. You know, they're going to have water. They're going to have, you think they're going to have resources, you know. And so in our rural area, we're trying to get our fire departments to be more, to have a large water tank available for people. When we were during the freeze, you know, people couldn't water their cattle or their horses or anything. They had no way to get water. Everything was frozen, and except for our fire station had some water available for people to come and as long as they had their own tanks, their own water tanks to haul in the back of their pickup trucks to take to their livestock. You know, things like that. I'd like to see the fire departments be ready for, you know, the people to come to them and what they can do to help that. And that's where we would need funding for that. You know, we're working on that at this time.
Thank you. That's very valuable information and feedback. One of the questions that I had posed, this is Evelyn, had posed in the chat, really was around for those entrepreneur support organizations, how many small businesses that they've been working with have actually developed business continuity plans. And Mildred Franco, who had to leave, she wrote, they're still trying to recover and manage day to day, but there is a true issue with capacity with those entrepreneur serving organizations to layer on yet another element. And so, Kendra, as for those who support entrepreneurs and small businesses on this call today, how do we support by increasing knowledge to share with small businesses without creating like this huge capacity drain?
Nothing. All right, we're about at time anyway. But I want to thank everybody for tuning in. More to come as we work through this and see where we can take some of these potential programs. But I definitely appreciate everybody being here, and thank you so much for your time.
Oh,
Thank you so much.
thank you for attending. Have a wonderful day, everyone.